welcome back to the podcast. Kelly Meyer is here, who is a very unique individual. He's been through so many things, from a seven-figure exit from the fitness industry. Kelly and his wife opened a craft brewery in 2012, and he spent nearly 10 years searching and not finding profitability before finally selling for a massive loss and moving on. So what is all this leading to? Well, I'm glad you asked, because now Kelly has taken what he learned into a book and a podcast, and it's called How Not to Start a Damn Brewery. So we're going to find out all about Kelly's life lessons and some of those commonalities, because sometimes you get in situation A, B, and C, and there's those overlapping factors, plus what he's done to build a podcast audience to over 100,000 downloads and so much more. So Kelly, super excited and pumped to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's not every day I get to have an intro like that, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, it pumps up the ego and just makes you feel good. And I mean, who wouldn't want that, right? It's like having a whole room applauding you and bowing and worshiping you. So that's what I'm here for you. So we introduced you a little bit, but in your own words, what are you all about? What makes you special? What has you passionate lately?
Oh, passionate lately is like right now, my main thing is just sort of changing the brewing world, and this kind of sounds kind of a bit egregious and maybe over the top, but that's what it boils down to, is that the brewing industry needs to change, and I'm excited to be that guy. So I'm a little bit of a pariah, but at the same time, I have a lot of fun doing it, and I have all the friends I need. So now I'm just trying to get out there and make a difference. So.
Okay, well, let's get into what you're doing to change the world, because when you think about what a brewery is, you think that it's like a collection of really cool people, right? It just seems more hip. Like a restaurant already is kind of cool, and then if there's like a bar or a lounge or a grill, you're like, well, I'm not sure about that. But a brewery is almost guaranteed to have the cool factor. But you also imagine, just from a layperson's point of view, that it sounds really stressful. It sounds really expensive. It sounds maybe even harder than a lot of other retail establishments. And that's just from first impressions. So tell me, am I off base, on base? What is the stressful, terrible experience of having a brewery?
Yeah, so let's bring the mood down a little bit, right? No,
Yeah.
I'll try to make it exciting and fun. But yeah, at the end of the day, really what happened is the brewing industry is fun. It is cool from the consumer's perspective, right? So if you're out there trying to say, 15 years ago, did I have this much access to unique and interesting beer, and could I try new stuff to excite my taste buds? That world is better for the consumer, but at the same time, it's worse for the brewery operator. So the profitability, broad stroke numbers, somewhere around 70% of the breweries in the United States operate a business model that is not currently profitable. And that with the current climate, there's no way to change that. Margins were always slim, but now there's so much competition. Costs have gone up, prices have not. There's just nobody making money except for a few guys at the top, and only because they're over leveraged, right?
Okay. So then that leads to the ultimate entrepreneurial question. Why would someone do this? Why would someone be so crazy to lose money, to get leverage, to have a loan? Why not just get a job as a Walmart greeter or an accountant at IBM or something?
Yeah, no, I've said many times that when I sold my first company, that there were a lot of things I could have done that would have made me more money. For example, opening up a strip center, I could have just done that. And or the one that blows my mind to this day is you make way more money operating storage units outside of like a bunch of neighborhoods with HOAs, but it's boring. Like, so the thing is, you can make money a bunch of boring ways, and the brewing industry is fun. And there is no way I'm going to try to sit here and tell you I didn't have a blast at some of these festivals, and that there weren't cool nights where I released my Oktoberfest, and I just had a few too many, and it was a blast with all my buddies. But the main reason to get into the beer industry is just because that's a thing you want to do, and you've got the cash to do it. There's not going to be, you're just not going to make money. So there's a lot of other ways to make better money. Like we had talked about, after I left the brewery, I sold it for a massive loss. That next year, 12 months to the day, I made more than I made the entire time on the salary, anyways, in the brewing industry in the next career. So it wasn't as cool, but I get the opportunity to drink beer for fun then. So, and I could afford it.
Okay. And that's an interesting insight right off the bat, that the amount of money you make and the cool adventureness factor, these are two different aspects. And it starts to hurt your brain a little bit when you think about money in these sorts of terms. Like I saw some graph a few years ago that said, like, okay, if you only go to high school, you make about a $500,000 in your lifetime. If you're go to college or you're a doctor, you make about $2 million. And when you start to think of that in like life terms, you think like, okay, if you sold a company and you made $10 million, you kind of like really don't need any more money. Like that's enough for maybe not like your grandchildren, but like you could just the rest of your life, $10 million would do you. And then even if you made like 100 grand, there's always the kind of the pessimistic, and inflation value money thing, but 100 grand, you could probably survive on that. And so there's a difference between making money and as much as you can or making money the boring way versus being like, okay, I can cover my nut. And then the other money, that's just my adventure, all these cool things that I'm doing. And so you kind of have these different stages of your life, right? You exited the fitness industry, you did the brewery, and then that led to the book and the podcast. So like, what do you feel like talking about? Like, where's the story here? Is there the fun story in the fitness, in the brewery, or in the book and podcast?
I don't know. I think in a way it's the whole thing, and there's going to come a point where I write a second book, and the second book is going to be all about what I've learned in 100 podcast episodes where I interviewed guys who went out of business, guys and girls, and so that's going to be an interesting story because I don't think it's been told in business yet. And I give the example of like Jim Collins. He has some really killer books that just really nerded out on the details of business in America, what works, what doesn't, built to last, good to great. These are ideas and concepts all built on primarily success. Even the failures were really sort of like success driven in the sense that they had their glory years. And so I'm really interested in that and excited to write that book and really dig into what we learn from failure without having to call it a success. Because I don't think it's been done. But as far as my career, I think the whole thing is interesting in the sense that, looking back, there were some very dark days. I'm not going to say that, but with the fitness thing, I did that for almost 10 years. It was like 8 or 9 years. Sold it for a bunch of money. Was kind of an arrogant jerk and went into the brewing industry thinking I knew everything about business and I was just going to come in and mop up. And that didn't happen. And so I got a little bit of kind of an ego check in a way, but also, found some Zen, found a better spot in my life, and then was very down when I left and have been very successful as a land sales consultant. And you're doing the podcast, again, it's all over the world now. I've interviewed people from Australia, UK, Canada, the US. So it just shows like you can fail and not be out of the game too. And I think that's a cool picture that there were, like I said, very dark times, but now the last 3 years have been fantastic and maybe the three best years of my career.
Wonderful. And that's a cool mindset there. There's a scarcity mindset of like, well, I have to count my pennies and hold all my money. And then the abundance mindset, which is, well, if I make a big mistake and the money's gone, you can always rebuild it. And the money kind of flows in and out anyway, right? You have to pay all your bills. You have to have this steady income. And hearing about your process now, and then also when we spoke on the phone a few weeks ago, it's kind of like Think and Grow Rich-ish, right? The whole like basically when there's these really good books, right? Like Jim Collins, for example, they do all this research, they look at hundreds of case studies, have hundreds of conversations, and then kind of let it all wash over and figure out what's like the topographic map, right? And figure out, well, what are all the common factors? Where does everyone start right? Where does everyone screw up? Just when you look at hundreds of people, what do they all do? What do they not do? It's interesting to think about. And so what have you discovered along those lines? Like in your own journey and in having these conversations, like what are the success factors that are maybe not talked about a lot?
Well, so I always tell people I'm an expert on failure, not so much success. So if you really want to ask me what I know best, it's what not to do. As far as like in the beer industry overall, and I think it still to this day blows my mind in all the industries, fitness, beer, even real estate, the idea of people understanding return on investment as the fundamental driver of the entire concept of business, it's not there. And it'll blow your mind how many businesses you walk into and they either don't understand the incoming leads and then how to process those and the value of the phone ringing or the people walking to the door. But more importantly, I'm not a big fan of business plans, but I'm a big fan of business models. And so in that sense, like what is your cost structure versus your potential revenue? And across the board, I would say that it's a minute less than 1% of the operators that I've talked to actually fundamentally understand that from a perspective-based situation. They can look at the P&L, they can tell you what their EBITDA is, some and even less, or a very small amount can even do that, but even to understand beyond that what that means and how to make changes incremental in your business, I think if you can't do that, you shouldn't be in business, period.
And that's huge. And that's deep to think about. Just like, do you know your numbers? And more importantly, do you know your actionable numbers? Because like, I think I saw a TikTok like a week ago where it was like some real estate conference and they were talking to people and they were like, hey, how many units do you have? And it was like down to the exact number, like 417. And what's your monthly income? They knew that. And they were like, how much do you make per tenant? And they knew that. And like, what's your goal for this year? And they knew that. And it was just like, and they answered so quickly, it was like this wasn't the first time they had thought about it or had answered it. They knew their numbers so well. And then again, going back to my kind of bystander mindset is you hear about this with people, and again, a lot in like restaurant industry or business people, they know like how much money am I making in my business per hour and every person that walks through the door. And when something on the menu is priced $7.75, there's like a specific reason for that. And so I think that's really cool. Just knowing what these numbers are, but also having the focus to knowing like what your important ones are, and then those KPIs to move the needle. And so how do we tap into that? Like you say, only 1% of operators are doing this. So is the solution to like get someone on staff to dial this in or to like completely change the way you think? Like, how do we go from bad to great, right? How do we go from not knowing these numbers or not doing it well to like what you described a moment ago?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is just having the education out there. And we have a trade organization in the beer industry called the Brewers Association, and they just really don't touch those things. And I'm not going to speculate as to why or tell you what the reason is, but I can tell you that it's got to start there because they're doing educational things and they're focused on the oxygen pickup in the canning line on a 10-foot run versus a 4-foot run, which, while important, is more of a master brewer's technical side. And I think the Brewers Association has a responsibility to really push home how we can make money as an industry since they make money off of breweries. And so I think that's important. There are some different kind of, I guess, publications that you call them. So newspapers, magazines within the industry that do some education, and they also aren't focusing on those kinds of things. So outside of that, I think it's going to be tough to move that needle. There is a podcast that talks a lot about it called How Not to Start a Damn Brewery, if you want to listen to that. But yeah, I think it starts there.
Okay, so it seems like we need to embrace this idea of learning and especially constant learning and networking and just talking to other people, especially the people that are doing well. And so we get that from the networking, but we also get that from listening to a podcast like yours to get that constant dose. And then also, I guess it comes down to somehow making the accounting work because you hear about like entrepreneurial operating system or like profit first. There's all these guys that they are like because there's like there's the technical as you said, right? There's like the step by step of your process of like, well, the oxygen content and whatever, but then there's like getting real and deep and strategic with the numbers. And so I think that that's something interesting to think about, just like what makes the failure versus what makes the success. And so, and also, you hear about how these people that are like really good accountants or really good business coaches, you can almost drop them into any kind of business, and there for sure would be like a learning curve, but you could drop these wizards into like a brewery, and they would then figure out some of these things you're talking about, right? Like, are you losing money? Are you gaining money? What can we change? And so you've been in all these different sort of industries. And what would you say is easier? Is it easier to market a gym, a podcast, or Texas land?
Well, I will say that I think timing is part of that. And so I don't own a gym today. And post-COVID, my understanding is that there's a lot of struggles in that industry. But I'll give you just from the perspective of what I did when I did it, that was by far the most profitable thing that I've done. And the reason is that you have the opportunity to pre-sell and get customers and revenue previous to even opening. And so if you've negotiated, which most people do, some sort of free rent structure or even delayed rent in the beginning, there were a lot of those businesses that I opened that were never or always profitable. We never lost money because we were able to generate business early on. And then it was membership based. And so you had a fixed cost. If I had 100 members versus 1,000 members, it cost essentially the same, a little bit more on payroll. So it could scale. And that's important that if you can scale with beer, you can't do that. If you scale revenue, you've got to scale costs. And that creates its own challenges that if it cost me $5,000 last month to make beer, but I need to make double this month, I don't just have the other $5,000 laying around. I've got to go find that somewhere to be able to do it. You didn't have to do that with fitness. Spend all your money up front, leverage it. You could borrow against everything, and then you can just sell. And so if you could sell, you could make a bunch of money. And so we did well doing that. Land is great, but real estate's kind of cyclical. So I would assume that there'll be some up and down years. I haven't had a down one yet, but I'm sure that I will. So
Interesting. So you're saying that whatever game you play, there's different rules, right? And there's different difficulties and different margins and especially different bottlenecks, and that kind of guides what you do, right? Like you might not want to scale a brewery, but you might want to scale the gym. And so that's interesting to think about that just based on knowing what the space is and knowing what the pluses and minuses are. Should you even get into it? Should you stay in it? And then what should you do? What's like the smart decision of what to do moving forward, right? Do you grow it? Do you keep it as is? Or do you exit it? And so in all of your travels, right, with the businesses, with the podcast, with all the adventures, has anything surprised you lately that you feel like sharing?
surprised me.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, I was surprised by an amazing beer the other day, but that's a whole different story. That so many of the breweries that I visited that grew during this last period just didn't have fantastic beer, and it was a lot of mediocre beer that grew through. And I've hit a brewery in Texas the other day, and everything was fantastic, made right, and just dialed in, and that just put a smile on my face in a way that I forgot how to enjoy beer. Which sounds weird being a guy who was in the industry for 10 years, but I kind of lost the love of it at the end. So that was a great surprise. I really enjoyed that. Um, but yeah,
And so would you say, okay, so when you go to like one of these breweries like you did recently and you go in and like all the beer's great and everything's great, like how do they accomplish that? Is that just a matter of attention to detail and like making sure all the little finer touches are in there? Like what separates just a mediocre brewery from a great one?
it'll be processes primarily, but the beer that comes out is going to be primarily based upon having good staff. So you've got to have an educated brewmaster. It's probably the restaurant industry is not that different, but as a rule, great brewers aren't the ones that have great recipes. They're the ones that know how to fix it when something goes wrong, whether on brew day or after. And so it does take an experienced guy to say, hey, our gravity's off, our pH is off. What do we do to make that adjustment now before it becomes a problem? So they have to be able to find that problem early and then fix that problem before it's a problem. And so it was that all the way through. So fermentation was done correctly, recipe was done correctly, it was executed correctly and written correctly. And then having the great equipment, because unfortunately a lot of breweries are using smaller and kind of like non-commercial size, non-commercial style equipment. So what comes out, they always say a great brewer can make great beer on any equipment, but at the same time, it does matter. And so having the right equipment, the right processes, the right ability to drop things out, add things in where they needed to be. And so in this case, it was just execution across the board with an attention to detail on the styles. So they were made correctly, they fit your palate the way they wanted to, and there was a balance of flavors that unfortunately you just don't get a lot. You'll get a beer that's like, oh, this tastes good, but there's just a ton of flavor, or there's not. So that primarily the best beers, the best selling beers in America don't have edges and don't have character, but craft beer is different. And so when you put that edges and character in there, it does take a skilled hand and almost an artisan to do it with balance.
Interesting. Well, cool. And you're giving me flashbacks to like the Marcus Lemonis, the profit guy, right? There's like the process, people, and product. And so like the product is the beer, is the equipment, and then you also need the process to have the right step by step to use it properly and to do it consistently. But then there's also the people because the people need to be able to follow the steps and then also to improvise, like you said, if like the pH is wrong or something like that. And then with the customer support and being educated. So that's interesting just to think about those factors or what that triangle ends up being. And you can't have two and neglect the other. You have to really have your stuff dialed in, especially in like a restaurant kind of space and a people kind of space. So it seems really stressful. You have to definitely like know your stuff, be at the top of your game. And so people are listening to this podcast here for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe they're brewery owners or brewery enthusiasts, or they want to know about Mr. Kelly Meyer here and just about your website and your podcast. And this could be a path back to them. So if someone says, all right, I'm really interested about your business lessons and possibly your book and your podcast. So what are some next steps here? What's the call to action? How does someone go and find out more about you?
So how not to start a damn brewery is the full name. If you type damn brewery in, I've done a good job making sure I own that. So even if all you can remember is damn brewery, you got me. So go look there. The book's on Amazon. The podcast should be just about everywhere you can think of. And yeah, that's a great place to start.
Fantastic. And it sounds like you have a lot of fun with your podcast and deliver a lot of lessons and meet a lot of interesting people and I just it seems like, as you said, your whole mindset is, well, let's focus on the failure because there's way more things to not do. There's way more content, fun stories there, and there's only a few ways to succeed, but a lot of what you learn, like even when you were describing the whole craft beer thing, right? Like, well, if you don't have the rounding out and if there's too many flavors, it's like if there's something that I'm doing wrong, I can immediately point to that and say, okay, stop doing that. And then it's whack-a-mole. I end up doing something else wrong. But if I keep on winning that game of whack-a-mole, eventually I can get things dialed in and have the money right and have how the right people and do the right things and do the right marketing. And there's a million things to be done. And that's why there's just not one singular book. That's why there's the ongoing podcast. But then to get the consolidation, to get the lessons, that's where the how not to start a damn brewery is. So you said search damn brewery, search how not to start a damn brewery, and then jump in and check out the podcast because someone who's on this show is listening to a podcast. They're a podcast tuner inner, so they need to then tune into your podcast. And as we've said, even if you're not that much of a brewery person, there's all sorts of fun business lessons. And it's like when you say you went to school and you had to learn math, and that's not fun. But if they taught you math in like a video game context or taught you math in context of like your favorite movie, now that's fun. So maybe someone who is interested in some of this business stuff, by hearing about these brewery stories, then they can learn these otherwise boring marketing lessons and kind of sneak the medicine in. So it's a lot of fun to think about. So how not to start a damn brewery, book and podcast from Kelly Meyer. And as we're wrapping up our conversation here, Kelly, do you have any just final lessons or quotes for us, or anything that we need to sneak in at the end that you think we forgot?
No, I don't think we forgot anything. I would say that the overarching message that I always want to tell people is follow your dreams, do whatever the hell you want. Just do it with your eyes open and mitigate your risk. But other than that, grip it, rip it, and have a life. Have some fun.
All right. Amen to that. Great advice. I love that mini list. Just live your life and go on that adventure. And for you out there as a podcast listener, the next step in your adventure is to check out Kelly Meyer's How Not to Start a Damn Brewery podcast and book. Check it out now. You'll be glad you did. Kelly, wonderful speaking with you.
You too, man. Appreciate it.